All right. Hey guys, topic 2.4, population dynamics. Okay. If you haven't looked at the slides or you weren't in class this past, the past few days, we looked at 2.3. So I would take a look at that before going into this. All right. But 2.4, right? During understanding in this topic here, right? Changes in population are due to mortality, fertility, and migration, which are influenced by the interplay of environmental, economic, cultural, and political factors. Right? That all makes sense soon, right? But here's the learning objective. Yeah, you should be able to explain factors that account for contemporary and historical trends in population growth and decline. And the first thing we're going to look at are demographic factors, right? Demographics being data about the structures and characteristics of human populations. So here are a couple of the key factors: fertility, mortality, and migration. All right, we won't dive too deeply into migration simply because we'll have a few topics this unit to look at that. But ultimately, these three determine a population's growth and decline, right? And they're all analyzed at different scales, right? I mean, that's just what geographers do, right? Because the data impacts the natural environment and society at different scales. So the first thing we're going to look at is fertility, right? And that's essentially the ability of women to produce children. All right. So keeping in mind that all of the data that I'm going to present to you, we're not going to account for migration at all. All right. If we did, that would add another layer of complexity, but we're not going to do that here. All right. So two measures of fertility we're going to look at. The first one being the crude birth rate, or the CBR. All right. And it's the total number of live births in a given year per 1,000 people in a given population. Right, so it could be read as such, if we're looking at Mexico, for example. 15 babies are born every year for 1,000 people. Right? The global CBR in 2018 was at 18.2 births per 1,000, with developing countries, peripheral countries being at 21.3. The lowest CBR is found in Europe, and the highest, as you can see here in Africa. All right. The second measure of fertility is the total fertility rate. This is the average number of babies a woman is expected to have as she passes through her childbearing years, so ability to have a child. Right. Geographers, have kind of put that age as 16 to 40. Right. And the total fertility rate, it's definitely more informative than the crude birth rate. Because it's age and gender specific. It provides a better comparison of fertility rates across countries and populations than CBR. All right, and TFR is also a direct expression of a country's health system, because it reflects a population's access to doctors, nurses, hospitals, and medicine. All right. And, like any statistic here, TFR can be impacted by and changed through several factors, by war, policies, increased urbanization, economic stability or instability, high levels of education among women, higher rates of women participating in the labor force, maybe the influence of culture and society, right? So it all changes. But generally, it tells us, family size. That's one thing geographers really focus on, right? A low TFR, will tell us that, family might have less kids. High TFR in a country will tell us, more kids, larger families, right? And that tells us other things as well. Right, and TFR attempts to predict future behaviors as well, right? Because if TFR is too low in one area, it hurts the area because maybe in the future they won't have as many workers, and um, that might stop them from progressing, right? I mean, we can look at Japan here with their the low TFR. Right, the world as a whole in 2018, the TFR was about 2.5. Sub-Saharan Africa, right? Some countries it's 5 or more, and in Europe and most of the developing countries it was 2 or less, right? And that's because of better education, increased job opportunities, right? So yeah, TFR that leads us to something called the replacement level. It's basically the number of children per woman necessary to keep a country's population constant, right? So the number here, right, for TFR would be 2.1 to 2.4, right? That's the ultimate goal for most societies, because that keeps population kind of level. You know, it ensures society continues to grow, but at the same time doesn't surpass its carrying capacity. Okay, so let's move on to mortality, right? Two measures of mortality. But before I go into that, just a note here on mortality, right? This is any death-related activity within the population, right? And circumstances that affect mortality rate, you know, include, you know, the availability and affordability of healthcare, or clean water, adequate food, shelter, right? And researchers, you know, they like looking at mortality here because, you know, when they study it, you know, they can explore solutions and policies to promote equitable healthcare access. All right. So that being said, crude birth rate or crude death rate, my bad, is what we're going to look at. So that should say CDR, not CBR. But CDR is the number of deaths per year in a population per 1,000 of the population. All right, pretty easy there. So the global crude death rate in 2017 was at 7.7, and it's actually been on the decline for the last 40 years. So 10 or below in a country is generally considered low CDR. 20 or higher is generally considered high. And interestingly enough, CDR is actually higher in developed countries than developing countries on average, right? I mean, there are many reasons for that. Probably because the aging population. There's a greater aging population. All right. So second measure of mortality, infant mortality rate. IMR, the number of babies that died during their first year, so those under 1 year or at 1 year per 1,000 live births, right? Kind of a sad statistic, but it's a pretty important one. And much like TFR being a better indicator than crude birth rate, infant mortality rate is a greater indicator than crude death rate. When it comes to explaining population growth or decline, right? So with infant mortality rate, these numbers are very important and they reflect the overall health and access to proper nutrition in the state. So generally speaking, high IMR equals a high TFR, right? And the reason for that is because in nations with a high IMR, a high TFR, right? They're going to be having more children, and they're expecting some to die. So for example, they could have think about 8 children. A couple could think about 8 children, but they expect 6 to live, right? And that impacts population growth in different ways, but we'll look into that later. All right, but yeah, if the number for the IMR is low, it means there's access to good health care and proper nutrition, clean water, and sanitation. So obviously, it's high in developing countries, right? Afghanistan, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so like I said, migration is one that we'll look at eventually, just not that much right now. But just know, as a little preview, there are 2 types of migration: immigration. Immigration is the act of leaving a location with the intent to settle someplace else, while immigration is the act of migrating to a new location, right? So you immigrate from where you are leaving, and you immigrate to where you're going. All right. I mean, we're not considering, any push and pull factors here, or refugees quite yet. All right. So yeah, ultimately, by comparing CBRs, CDRs, and TFRs, geographers have concluded that the world has a large and young population, the largest percentage of which are countries in the periphery, and obviously this places a lot of pressure on education, healthcare systems, and employment opportunities. So developed nations, they're going to face their own issues with a rising older population. But as always, data depends on scale here, right? We could look at it one way globally, but it might differ for some countries, and even then, it might differ, more locally, urban versus rural. Okay, cool. So that being said, we're going to look at 2 other pieces of data here to analyze trends in population growth and population decline. So explaining population growth and decline. Okay. So the first is the natural increase rate, NIR. Sometimes you might see it as the rate of natural increase, I believe, right? It's, you know, as long as you see increase rate, you know, that's NIR or RNI, right? So the NIR is a statistic that compares the birth rate and the death rate of a country for population growth or decline, right? And you know, this doesn't include immigration or immigration. So it's calculated as such, CBR subtracted by CDR divided by 10, right? If you get a positive number, then the population is growing. If you get a negative number, then the population is most likely declining. Okay, so a country that has a CBR of 34.39 and a CDR, 17.8, right? Subtract those, divided by 10, right? You get this percentage, right? Population is growing at 1.65%. So globally speaking, the NIR peaked in 1963 at 2.2%, and it's been on decline ever since. Projections indicate that by the year 2100, right, in 80 years, it'll be at 0.1, right? So I mean, that's just looking at it globally. But currently, after some research by the UN, right, it looks like the world is generally speaking at like a 1.1 NIR. Okay. So like I said, globally it's at 1.1, but that hides the fact, how some nations are dealing with their natural increase rate, right? So obviously, I mean, you can see here, sub-Saharan Africa, these peripheral countries, right? The natural increase rate is pretty high compared to other regions in the world, right? So the U.S. looks to be generally stable, right? I mean, you can see some countries, a lot of them in Europe, Japan, maybe experiencing a decline, right? And actually are experiencing a decline. All right. So yeah, the second data here that geographers look at is population doubling time, DT, right? The amount of time it takes for a population in a given area to double, right? It's calculated using what's called the rule of 70, so 70 divided by the natural increase rate. So I mean, we could project Ethiopia's doubling time in 2019 based on its NIR of 2.6%. So 70 divided by 2.6, 26.9 or 27 years, right? So that's how long it'll take for Ethiopia's population to double, right? That's what it's calculating, right? And, goes without saying, that this is important because society needs to understand and plan accordingly for the future, right? Because population growth occurring in places, a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, right? They're the places least equipped to support larger numbers. Okay. So social and culture. Okay, so let me back up here. Right. So now we're gonna look at if I could go all the way back here. Right. Right. Now we're gonna look at the influence of environmental, economic, cultural, and political factors, right? To everything we just looked at. Okay. So social and cultural factors, right? They can affect fertility, mortality, and migration, right? And at different scales as well, right? So for just looking at these factors, right, we can look at why some countries are shrinking and why some are growing, right? Why some might be shrinking: more access to wealth, better healthcare, access to medicine and treatments, right? That means people are going to live longer, right? Education, and when looking at this, right, I'm more specifically looking at more opportunities for women, right? More access to higher paying jobs, greater participation in society, right? So, I mean, if there's a greater participation, right, if there's more access to higher paying jobs, if you're going to college, if you're getting the master's degree, the doctoral degree, right, you know, there's going to be less time to raise a family, right? So, as women are feeling more empowered, right, there's going to be a lower TFR, right? So, family size is going to decrease, which means that the population growth rate is also going to decrease, right? The NIR, right? Specifically, this is happening in developed countries, and we'll look at this a little bit more with the demographic transition model, all right? But yeah, why are some countries growing? You know, A lot of it has to do with some old time traditions, right? The age of marriage and traditional family size values, right? If marrying young is culturally expected, right, the fertility rate is going to be higher, right? Some religions, forbid or have taught against birth control, contraception, right? Or looking at ethnicity, right? Certain ethnic groups just generally have larger families, right? And that might tie into religion as well. Okay. Political factors can also influence fertility, mortality, and migration rates, right? So governments can play a huge role in population growth, right? There might be policies on limiting or encouraging children. There might be what we call pro-natalist policies, right? So government, they could fund programs, right, or promoting, population growth, so encouraging childbirths, right, or antinatalist policies, right? Those that try to limit population growth, right? So China's 1-2 child policy, right? I mean, we'll look at this a little bit more, these policies surrounding population growth or decline. Um, yeah, or there might be government supports, funds, healthcare for society, right? Some governments might pay for childcare, and there might be tax incentives that are lost to prevent larger families, right? Other times it might be conflicts or war, right, which cause instability. This can lead to high mortality rates or migration, right? Perhaps people won't want children in these times, right? Or maybe the opposite, right? After a war, everything is good. People are going to want children and all of that. So political factors, right? Economic factors as well can influence fertility, mortality, and migration rates, right? So birth rates go up during prosperous times or might decline in times of hardship, right? I wonder how this is all affecting, COVID-19, how this is all affecting, or maybe it's not affecting population growth, right? Developing societies, with a more agricultural based economy, right? They might have large families, right? Because you need, extra hands to help out, right? Developed societies, right? More urbanization there, right? Family size is going to go down, right? Because of the costs of living, near cities, right? And it's economically not beneficial, to have so many mouths to feed, right? And eventually maybe pay for college, right? And we could also look at the access to healthcare, right? It might be high and it'll cost money, right? Migration, right? People are going to migrate towards areas of economic opportunity, right, and away from areas that don't have access to jobs and resources. So that might increase the mortality rate. Crude death rate lowers when there's better access to healthcare, medical treatments, nutrition, clean water. All right, and lastly, environmental factors influence fertility, mortality, and migration rates. Right. So, I mean, obviously, natural disasters, famine. If we're thinking of the plague in the 1300s, right? The spread of diseases, right? The Spanish flu, or even COVID today. Or we could just look at societies, whether or not they're agriculture, developing or developed, right? So some societies still in subsistence culture, agriculture, they rely on the land, so, but when you rely on the land so much, right? More desertification, depletion of natural resources, right? And so that happens. So some might not think rationally, right? And have more children so that you can get more, but it's a cycle, right? More desertification because of that, more depletion of natural resources, right? In urban areas, right? Will there be enough resources, right? With people living there, right? Pollution and all that. So yeah. Okay, guys. If you have any questions about 2.4 here, let me know. And yeah, go back and look at some of these things, and make sure you get it. Up next is the demographic transition model, and it's going to be kind of looking at, combining population pyramids and looking at all of these pieces of data here all at once. So next lecture is going to be super important. So see you then.